I'm Paulina Lee, and this is Here at Haas, a student-run podcast connecting you to Haassies and the faculty that change our lives. This week on Here at Haas, we are joined by Adin Menkin from the Evening Weekend Program, class of 2021. Adin is a student leader, finance and strategy professional, a collegiate football player, and an Iron Bison. Thanks for coming on the show, Adin.
Hey, thanks. Glad to be here.
How's your week been going?
It's going great. It's sprinting forward just like the rest of the summer and pretty much this whole year.
Yeah, the summer has flown by. I don't even know how it's the end of July.
I know. It's insane.
And you're calling in from Texas, right?
Yes. Plano, Texas, right near Dallas.
Awesome. Well, I'd love to start with you just sharing a little bit about your background, where you're from, where you went to undergrad, and how you ended up in the Bay Area.
Of course. My parents are from South Africa, and part of the reason I say that is because from a young age I started playing soccer, and my dad got me really into it. And so, grew up playing, and I even played in the Youth World Cup. And, I kept playing, I was loving it, and then after a while kind of got burnt out on it, and then I guess made the natural transition that most kids do these days, and they start kicking footballs. So I grew up in the Houston area and then ended up getting a scholarship to a school in Arkansas. And the school is called Harding University. It's a Division II school. It's right outside of Little Rock. And so had an incredible time there. Small school, made a ton of awesome friends, and majored in finance. And the Walmart headquarters is actually pretty close to Harding, and they actually recruit pretty heavily outside of there. And so ended up doing a couple internships with Walmart there, and then ended up joining full-time. They have this rotational program that's pretty neat, and so it spans over 2 years, and every 6 months you basically have a different job. And so for somebody coming out of school not quite sure what they want to do, this is like a perfect scenario. And so actually during those 2 years, I did 6 months in San Francisco. So there's an e-commerce office with Walmart out in the Bay Area. And so I did 6 months out there, came back, and then just kind of fell in love with it and was trying to find a way to make my way back to the Bay Area. And so I ended up doing that. 2016, I came out to the Bay Area and started working for e-commerce. And during that time, also got married the weekend before, moved to San Francisco. So a ton of change during that time. A lot of fun,
All at once.
A lot of learning. Yep, mostly outside of work. But it was great. And so, I've been in the Bay Area for 4 years now. And Walmart's such a massive company. I've probably had 6 different jobs during the 6 years that I had been there. And that's kind of led me to where I am right now. And so the way I ended up at Haas was a little bit of happenstance. So as soon as I moved to the Bay Area, the manager I had at the time kept nudging me and saying, like, I know you want to go to business school. I've wanted to go ever since undergrad. And she kept telling me, why don't you just do it part-time? Berkeley has a fantastic program, and there had been some people at Walmart who had done it before. And she kept saying, like, do it. And I was like, no, I want to go full-time. And so I'd been applying to all these full-time schools, the East Coast and the South, and this was around 2018. And right as I submitted all my applications, my wife, she does medical sales, and she got a promotion, and I was like, well, shoot, it's not going to make a lot of sense if we move. And we sort of came to San Francisco for me, and so maybe it makes sense to stay a little longer. And so I quickly applied to Haas. I was like, all right, maybe this is a good decision to come to the part-time program. And so I applied, and here we are. It's awesome.
Well, I wanted to take a step back to our intro too, and wanted to ask you a little bit more about the Iron Bison.
Oh gosh, the Iron Bison. So it doesn't have anything to do with the Iron Man, for one. The Bisons were the mascot of the school I went to, Harding, and so I mentioned that I was a kicker in school, and I think the stereotype of most kickers is that they're not the most athletic, or they're scrawny. They're kind of these odd people, and I'm not saying that I'm not, but while I was in school, I was trying to kind of change that stereotype, and so I would work out with all the other positions, and I would compete with them, and so every fall we would have this big strength and conditioning competition, and if you're one of the top performers, you become the Iron Bison. And so one of the years I competed pretty hard and I won that award. And it was a while ago. For some reason, all the clothes that I wore back then have grown a lot, and I don't know I don't know how that happens.
Oh, I feel you. I still have some of my like practice shirts from college that I still wear.
You were an athlete, huh? I mean, still
Yeah.
are.
Yeah, played field hockey in college. I mean, for me, playing a sport in college, I didn't enter high school and think to myself, I'm going to go play field hockey in college. It kind of more developed over time.
Yeah.
And I think it definitely affected where I am today and how I think about different things. As you look back at your undergrad, how was being a collegiate football player influencing your life today?
I think a lot of it has to do with being on a team sport. I mean, in football, there's a lot of other team sports, obviously, but football, I think, is one where it's, it's the whole gridiron principle, and you have to have the person's back who you're lined up next to. Of course, I didn't line up next to too many people, but it's the whole experience, and so it's constantly thinking from the standpoint of it's not about me, it's about the team, and if I don't do my job, then this whole system fails. So it's kind of ingraining that into you. And then it's also shared experiences is pretty neat. I think that kind of shapes you. And who knows, maybe this whole Corona thing is like we're on one big weird team and we have this big shared experience. So I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah, I totally agree. So I'd love to dig into a little bit more about your Walmart experience. I know they recruited heavily on campus, but what made you want to join such a large retailer out of college?
So it was interesting. Coming out of college, my main two options that I'd kind of narrowed down to was going to Walmart or going to this oil and gas company called Murphy's Oil. And it would have been a really interesting opportunity. It was in El Dorado, Arkansas, the city of gold, quite small. And so joining Walmart seemed to be like the big unknown. I mean, it was a massive company and there's so much opportunity. And I'd kind of gotten a feel for it doing a couple internships there and sort of knew what I was into. But I think the biggest thing that drew me there was the leaders in the organization. They're all just really good people. And so that kind of ultimately drew me to it.
And you said about 6 different roles at Walmart. You've done a variety of different work, right? So working with the online grocery team, acquisitions, incubation, really a lot of white space areas that Walmart has been investing in. As you look at your career at Walmart, what has been your favorite role, or what role did you learn the most from?
So I guess starting off with online grocery, that was a ton of fun. That was my first job coming out to San Francisco, and it was one of the first times I'd been in a kind of startup environment. I mean, it was, the business was growing triple digit, and my first kind of responsibility was helping do the long range planning for the organization. We typically look out 5 years and then we do a next year snapshot. And I remember it was 2017 and we were just wrapping up the plans for the next 5 years, that aren't going to change whatsoever. and that was the same time that Amazon had acquired this other little company called Whole Foods.
Yeah.
So we basically had to scrap all these wonderful plans that we had made and completely start from zero. But it was a ton of fun. I mean, it was awesome looking at such a massive organization come together, and we had these big strategy meetings and made decisions really fast and hoped for the best. So that was a ton of fun. But I think more recently, so you mentioned the incubation group. This was pretty neat. So about 2.5 years ago, Walmart launched this incubation arm. It's kind of like corporate venture capital, and they called it Store 8 because back in Walmart's history, that store number 8, the 8th store that was opened, was like the experimental store that Sam Walton would kind of tinker with. And so this incubation organization named Store 8, we launched a portfolio of 5 different incubation companies, and I mean, they were so different. One of them was working on augmented reality, virtual reality in stores. How do we incorporate that? Another one was working on conversational commerce, so natural language processing. And so, me coming into this with retail experience and not as much on the tech side was just wild, and thinking about how we can put some structure in, but not too much. We don't want to sort of overwhelm and overcrowd these startups that aren't used to the corporate environment. So that was a super interesting learning opportunity.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting because I have been with Procter & Gamble for 8 years this summer, but have also done a ton of roles on our Walmart team. So I think between the two of us, we have a lot of Walmart knowledge. But I think one thing that I've loved working with Walmart that I don't think a lot of people understand is like all the innovation that the teams are working on and the different things that people are trying, especially in the Bay Area, because our nearest Walmart is, I mean, from San Francisco, it's 37 miles or something,
yes,
I think the office says. So it's cool that you're kind of at the crux of like one of the largest retailers in the entire world, but also at this point where they're really trying to push the envelope, really trying to put a stake in the ground to continue winning in retail in the future versus competition, both here in the US and outside. Do you think that these roles that you've done have changed your outlook in terms of what you want to do going forward?
Yeah, I mean, if anything, it's let me know that there is so much outside of the organization. I mean, it's so massive, and I guess it kind of ties into going to business school is you automatically start thinking more broad, whether you like it or not. You start thinking about all the stakeholders and the suppliers and the Procter & Gamble's and all these other people that help make Walmart what it is, and a company can't succeed on its own. And so it started making me think about what are other roles out there, even outside of finance, that could be interesting. And so I guess a couple of the things that I've been curious about and may or may not have written essays about it going into school was consulting. I've always been curious about. I've worked with a lot of brilliant people who are former consultants, and I really look up to them. And so that's one thing I've always been really curious about. And so this past spring, I worked with a boutique consulting firm doing change management consulting. And that was, a very different experience. It was for higher education. And so that sort of opened my eyes to what it could be like as a career. And I did that for about 3 months. And I'd worked with consultants before, but never obviously in their shoes. And so I gained a bit of a new respect for them. But I think ultimately I decided it's, not quite the path for me.
Not for you.
Yeah. I mean, what I love is being in an organization and then being able to influence and take plan from ideation to execution. And consulting is typically only one piece of that. Mm. And then, more recently, one of the other things I've been curious about is it's kind of a buzzword now, but biz ops,
Yeah.
It's the blend between analytics and operations and being smart about making decisions, which sounds a lot like finance.
Yeah.
And so that's what I've been doing for the past couple of months, helping a company out here in Dallas doing that. And that's been super interesting, very different.
Yeah, that's great. So 2018 was when you started applying to full-time programs and then obviously pivoted and applied to Haas's part-time program. At that point in your career, why did you decide that was the time that you wanted to go back to school? And how are you thinking about the different schools that you applied to?
I guess 2018 was the time frame that I always sort of had in mind. I wanted to get 4 to 5 years experience before going to school. So that didn't change. Obviously, going the part-time route was a big pivot in my mind. The schools that I was focused on applying to it's mostly geographic based. So, I applied to UT. My family's from Austin area. I applied to Michigan. My wife's family's from Michigan. And so I was kind of thinking about it in that way, and obviously visited the schools, thinking about culture and then the alumni in those areas. But yeah, I was not thinking about Berkeley at the time. And was honestly not thinking about the Bay Area as a home when we first moved here, but it's worked out quite well.
Fell in love with it for a little bit at least.
I know.
And you made a big career change, deciding to leave Walmart this spring. I know you talked a little bit about doing consulting this spring and then interning this summer, but how did you come to that point where you're like, this is the time I want to leave the home I started in?
I think I sort of had that time frame in mind. Part of it was a little bit more tactical. I took a ton of classes this past spring, and so I knew it was going to be really tough to get a lot out of those classes. And I was doing negotiations, which I know you have to put a ton of time into, and I was taking some analytics classes. So that was part of it. And then also just taking time off. At the turn of the year is always typically a good time. We have most of the plans in order, or that's typically the plan, to put the plans down. And it's just easy from a company standpoint. I also didn't want to leave things on fire and put people out, so it was a good natural transition.
And tell me a little bit more about the change management consulting. So I think you've kind of learned that it's not quite for you, but would love for you to talk about how you got involved and what else you learned during that time.
So I knew I wanted to do something else in the spring, and I think the part-time program maybe sort of drills this into you, or maybe it's just me to kind of be somewhat hyperactive and always doing something. And so even though I had a heavy class load, I was like, well, I'm used to working 50 or 60 hours, so that can't take all that time, so I have to figure something else out. So I was looking at doing something else, at least part-time, and so this opportunity came up through CMG. So I just applied to it, and it was a little bit of a different take since it was change management, and it was very different in the sense that it's not your typical strategy or implementation or doing deep analytical analysis. The way I sort of understood it or describe it is that from a finance background, I'm so used to thinking like numbers first and what's the ROI of this project. But doing change management was all about the people. So it's like, okay, what's the impact on people? The company that we were helping out was in higher ed. And so they're doing all these different changes, changing financial systems, the way they do HR. And so everything we did and helped them think through was like, okay, what's the impact on people? How are they going to react to it? How should we message things? And less so like, what's the numbers impact? So that was a super cool experience.
Sounds like you need a psychology degree.
I feel like I do. I was way inadequate for that.
And then you're interning this summer, which I think is kind of different for a lot of evening weekend students, right? So most of us just keep working full time the whole time of our program. I think you're one of the few that I've met, at least, that did an internship. So tell me about that process, recruiting, applying, and then how the summer has been for you.
Yeah, it's a super cool experience, and I guess that's one of the neat parts about the evening weekend program is you get some flexibility. There's a lot of uncertainty with it, so to the extent you can balance that, it works out. But yeah, I was looking through the career management center as well, and just talking to a bunch of different people. But the company that I ended up with I knew some people from my alumni and undergrad who worked there, and so we were talking quite a bit, and ended up working out that I could go down there around the time that I wanted to and work there for just a few months during the summer. And the opportunity ended up being perfect as well, because I was looking for something that was in this sort of biz ops space and not to do something strictly finance, because I sort of know what that world is like. So the company that I started working for is super interesting. It's Govtech, which is another space that I had not heard much about. So government tech. And what the company does is they've figured out a way to digitalize pawn shop receipts. So the way that pawn shops work right now is that by law, they are required to submit these pawn tickets when somebody pawns something to a local jurisdiction, to a police department. And what this company has done is digitalize all of that. So previously, if someone were to say steal a TV in San Francisco and then drive down to San Jose to sell it at a pawn shop, those two police departments would disappear from the face of the earth. They'd have no way to talk to each other. So they've kind of connected all those systems.
Very cool. Do you think that biz ops is what you want to do next, or are you still exploring?
So I'm not quite sure if biz ops is what I want to do longer term, but the interesting thing that I'm kind of noticing now is that I think biz ops, and it's just using data to help people make better decisions, which is a lot of what finance is in a sense. And I think those two spaces are ultimately kind of blending. I see a lot of positions that are like, head of finance and analytics, or head of strategic finance. So I think those two worlds are kind of blending together, and so that's sort of what I'm most interested in, and finding companies that see value in that.
Yeah, I think the brains that look at numbers are very similar, and it's just applying them in different ways. That or they're just trying to consolidate, so you're going to be wearing, 4 hats, but one job.
Yes. Which if you can get paid for wearing all the 4 hats, that's good too.
Right. How was your first year at Haas? You got involved as a student leader back then, and tell me a little bit about your first year in the evening weekend program.
Yeah, first year was wild. It was like the first few months of Corona. You just don't know what's happening, and you're trying to figure out what a new normal is. And I remember going into it, I made this big spreadsheet of like, okay, I'm going to work for these hours, and then I'm going to do homework during these hours, and that was scrapped really quick. But it was a ton of fun. I mean, it's totally like going into undergrad to some degree. There's so many people to meet, so many new experiences, so much learning. But it's cool. It was such a humbling experience as well. I remember during we launched the kickoff weekend that we have, you meet all these people and they're from all these different backgrounds, and you're thinking about like, okay, so I guess since I'm coming from a finance background, that kind of pegs me with the finance people, and therefore people who are not in finance don't know about finance, but that is not the case. So I even remember sitting in accounting classes, and I was thinking like all the subjects that would kind of come up, I would think, I've kind of thought through this quite a bit. And the questions that some of my classmates would ask were just brilliant, and I would kind of look over and I would think like, whoa, that person is a scientist. I would not think that they would think of that question.
Right.
So yeah, it's just very humbling.
And what do you think you learned in your first year that you applied coming back into year 2?
That's a good question. I think I learned, it's a bit obvious, but just maybe appreciated the value of the relationships. I remember before starting, I was talking to all these folks who had gotten their MBA, or they were getting their MBA at the time while I was applying, and they're like, the way to think about getting an MBA is in 3 parts. So there's the networking piece, there's what you learn in the classroom, and then there's the career opportunity piece. And I was like, okay, so I need to keep the balance. But, going into it, I'd learned pretty quick that the network can overshadow all of that. You can learn even more in the classroom if you collaborate and talk to the right people, and then that opens up career opportunities. And so I just appreciate that a lot more.
And how are you thinking about the network portion as we go into year 3 fully remote?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, we'll have to figure something out. I think there's all these interesting apps, like Donut is one that I want to explore, where you can have these sort of one-off meetings and make up for the running into somebody random while in the quad type of thing.
There's so many unknowns this semester, this year in the world. It's hard to predict, but we'll have to think of some good creative ways. I think there was a lot of energy when we first went fully remote. Everyone was like, we can hang out on Zoom for 6 hours. It's fine. We'll do it.
Yeah, no problem. Your eyes won't hurt.
Exactly. But then when, we're, 6-7 months in now, I think people will have to think about it and be like super intentional and figure out how do we still make the most out of this experience, even though everything looks completely different. So you're very involved. I believe you were an academic cohort rep your first year, and then you were involved in We Launch as a cohort leader.
Yeah.
And I've had the opportunity to work with you over the last, over half a year now, on the exec team. So would love to understand why you got involved in student leadership while at Haas.
Part of it, I think, is just, maybe not being the best at saying no to opportunities, which I don't know. It's a balance for sure, but it usually ends up working out in good ways. I wanted to be involved, and so after doing the social cohort rep during We Launch, I realized, hey, there's some pretty cool people in other classes, maybe like Paulina and others. But that was super neat. So I wanted to think of different ways that I could get involved still and, work across the different years. And so one of my friends reached out to me, asked if I wanted to be involved. And this is George from my cohort. And he was asking me, and I was like, I don't know. I need to think about the time commitment. And then he gave me all these quotes of these executives. They run companies and they're able to do all this too. I was like, all right, that's a great point. And so Yeah, I joined, and super glad I did. It's been a ton of fun, and met a ton of great people. And I think during this time especially, there's so much that we can stand up and do to help folks and kind of be a voice.
Do you think you've learned anything out of either this role on the exec team or in any of the other student leadership roles you've had that is a new skill or a new thing about yourself?
The one thing that I thought of recently is, so it goes back to the first opening weekend when we launched, and you may have done this too, but it was the concept of deep and brief. Mm-hmm. And so you have to take this 2-minute break, and you turn to somebody next to you, and you have to talk about yourself or tell a story. So you go real deep, but it's brief, and it's okay.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be weird, and it's cool. You can carry on and be friends. And so I think that's kind of stuck with me, and I was reminded of it recently because at this company I'm working with now, this coworker that I have next to me, he's a super cool guy, and it was early in the morning. It was, 7:30 in the morning, and he leans over to me and he says, "Hey, what motivates you?" And I thought he was kind of messing with me. And so I was like, kind of joking around with him. And he's like, "No, really, what motivates you?" I was like, "Oh, cool." And so, we talked about it, and it reminded me, I was like, previously, maybe before coming across that concept, I would have taken it a totally different way, but I was like, this is super cool. It's okay. And you can have a deep and brief conversation, and it's cool. And I admire him for that.
For sure. You know what my next question is going to be, right? Like, you're going to have to answer that now. What motivates you, Adin?
I have to go deep and brief. You caught me. So I read Simon Sinek's book, Starts With Why, and took some time to think about it. And my motivation is to help people realize and reach their full potential. What it makes me think of is actually the podcast that you guys did with Jarrett, right? And he was talking about his experience, which is incredible. If you haven't listened to that one, go listen to our friend Jarrett. But he talked about the idea of, if you've grown up and you haven't known what else is around you, then your opportunities are automatically limited. And I think he gave an example of saying, if somebody asked you, what's your favorite spice, and all you know is pepper, then you're going to say that, and you don't know about cayenne and all these other things. And so that's like the realizing part, and then the reaching your full potential is kind of everything outside of that and beyond it.
That's great. I mean, that's an exercise I'm still working through myself. It's funny because our first semester we have leading people, and it's a lot about cultures at companies and how companies can create impactful cultures and actually have meaningful mission statements and visions. And it just got me thinking, as a person, what is my vision? What is my mission statement? What is my core values?
Yeah.
And I think we all have it in our heads of like who we are as people, but so rarely do we actually take the time to write it down and like stare at it.
Yeah.
So I don't have that answer for you, so you're not allowed to ask it.
Give you one.
But it's something that I've been kind of musing on this summer in terms of, given the world where it is today, it's given a lot of extra time to think about these things. So it's, what do you want to do with your life?
Well, and it's tough because I think we're all work in progress. And so you might think of something and you're like, oh, no, that's not right. Or you might hear somebody speak and you're like, oh, okay, I should do that. Exactly.
What has been your favorite Haas memory in your past 2 years?
You're good at asking the tough questions. The first one that popped into my mind is going to Tahoe. This was, I guess, last spring. My whole cohort got together and we all rented a bunch of cabins out in Tahoe, and we spent the weekend out there, and it was super fun. It was just like celebrating conquering the first year and not thinking too much about how much we still have ahead. But it was so fun just getting outside of the city.
Yeah. And what do you think has been your favorite class so far? I'm asking this selfishly as I'm getting ready to look at electives again.
Smart. The two that come to mind, well, okay, maybe I have three. So the first one you have probably taken already. So it was accounting, which is odd. This was mostly because of the professor. So Yaniv is the professor of that class, and he's just an incredible human. When we first entered the class, he just starts clapping, and everyone's like, what is going on? and he keeps clapping until like everyone starts clapping with him, and then he puts his arms up and he yells, "Accounting!"
That's amazing.
It's like, I didn't know you could do that. I didn't know accounting was so exciting, but I'm in it. So that was super fun. And then this past spring, there was not clapping or yelling involved, but I took negotiations and then a class called marketing analytics. And those were super interesting because I think they're just very applicable. Negotiations is more or less what you would expect, a lot of tough, awkward conversations that you have to have, and you take time being critical after every conversation that you have. And then marketing analytics was super interesting as well, and it's what I've actually used a lot this summer, so very practical.
Nice. And as you go into your final year, are you planning on graduating in
graduating period? I don't know. I don't know
2021.
I'm shooting for 2030 now.
Yeah, right. We have a full 5 years that you can take to do the program.
That is
where
true.
I think they literally kick you out. But I guess as you go into the next year, what are your goals and your plans?
So I definitely want to try my best, however possible, to spend more time with folks in my class, and then also get to know the other classes, so the class of 22 and 23, as much as possible. It's obviously very different how that's going to happen. It's TBD, but I think that's the main thing. And then also enjoying the city as much as I can. I don't know if I'll be in the Bay Area for another year or maybe 3 years, or who knows. So I just want to enjoy the Bay Area.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think especially after this summer, I didn't take any electives and tried to stay in touch, but not as well as I would have hoped. I think we all hit a little bit of Zoom fatigue.
Yeah.
So I think being like more intentional on how to get those interactions, and then how to get those interactions across classes, across cohorts. There are so many people within my class that are not on the Saturdays that I don't know. So I'm hoping to figure that out.
Yeah.
We'll have to brainstorm.
Get to know your blue and gold friends.
Exactly. Obviously, you had always hoped to go and get your MBA. I'm very similar. But has the MBA experience thus far met your expectations of what you thought? And what have you learned about yourself?
So the MBA has definitely exceeded my expectations. I think going into it, I had more of an academic lens about it. Like, I'm going to learn all the skills and the frameworks and all those things, but it's a lot more squishy in a way on the people side. And like I said, it's really humbling. So from that respect, it's been super interesting to get to know a lot of people that I wouldn't normally interact with. And Haas is a pretty awesome, quirky little place. And then what I've learned about myself, which is a much easier question. I used to think that I wanted to be a better version of myself, but now I'm trying to be a more authentic version of myself. And that's not easy, but it's fun, and it's rewarding, and it's a work in progress. So check back in with me in like 1 week.
Perfect. I think that's great. I think it's true. I think when you're growing up and those first couple years of undergrad, you see all these great leaders and you're like, I'm going to be like this person and that person. You try and grab all these different things, which I think is great. You definitely want to learn from others. But there comes to a point where you just have to stop and be like, okay, I have all these different things that I've inputted from other people, but like, who am I and how does that come to life for me? Because that's what's going to feel the best long term and take the least amount of energy every day.
Yeah, exactly. That's, it makes paying the bills for an MBA worth it.
Self-discovery.
That's right.
Exactly. What do you want to do when you graduate?
When I grow up?
The big question.
The big question. I don't know if I can answer the big question yet. I'm not quite sure. I think there's a big opportunity that I could come back to this company where I am now. I think there's an opportunity that I could go back to Walmart. No idea. Still need to have those conversations. And then there's the unknown. I'm talking to a lot of recruiters right now, and oddly enough, there's a lot of open finance positions. Sadly, it may or may not have to do with Corona and people realizing that finances are important.
Awesome. Well, I wanted to transition to a little fun ender that we sometimes do. It's called This or That, and so we get to learn more about your preferences. So if you're reading, do you prefer audiobooks, ebooks, or paper books?
Paper, 100%.
Any books that you've read recently that you would recommend?
I'm reading one now. It's called Dream Big. It's by Bob Goff. He's one of my favorite authors. He's kind of a wild dude. He puts his phone number in the back of all the books that he writes because he's all about engagement and being available, which is a little insane. I mean, the guy probably gets thousands of calls, but
have you called him yet?
I called him a few years ago. I was super nervous to do it, and he picked up and he's like, "Hey, what's up?" And then I didn't know what to say.
He's probably also used to that, like.
I know. He's like, "Yeah, I actually picked up. This is my number." And we just, we talked for a little while, but it was super cool. He's just a totally normal dude.
That's great. Are you a Spotify Music or Apple Music, or how do you stream your music?
Spotify. Yes.
What's your go-to work playlist?
It's not a established playlist, but I have a bunch of instrumental songs. Maybe it was influenced, I think one of the other people you had on the podcast, Dr. Youssef. Like she said she had the same songs that she's listened to over and over for years. But Artie is one of the bands on there. So yeah, it's just instrumental stuff.
Nice. Mine is Tropical House.
Oh man.
So it's
Are you trying to escape?
Upbeat. Yeah, just upbeat stuff. But it skews my whole recommendation because I don't listen to it really unless I'm working.
Yeah.
And I don't even know how I stumbled upon
wild
it.
Recommendations.
Are you a Netflix, Amazon Prime, or Hulu?
Netflix. Most recent show that I've watched is the Bill Gates. It's like a 3-episode series. It's Inside Bill Gates' Mind. And then I also started watching Seinfeld, and then I scrapped it pretty quick. There's way too many episodes.
But I feel like that's one you could just watch and then, come back to weeks later.
Yeah. George Costanza will still be there. He's not going anywhere.
Exactly. And are you a morning or an evening person?
Morning person.
Morning.
Haas has sort of changed that. I think I'm really early and really late person. The middle is
awake
just
at all hours.
Yeah.
I agree because I think typically I'm a morning person. I typically wake up around 5:30, 5:45, and I would say preschool I'd like to climb into bed at 9:30.
Yeah.
But when you're working on, class projects and there's meetings that go till 10:30, it doesn't quite work out.
Right. Easy to wind down after that.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, anything else that you wanted to share on the show or any other parting words of wisdom for either current or prospective students in their Haas MBA journey?
I think the only advice that they really need is to continually listen to this podcast.
That's great.
But really, no, you guys are doing awesome. Yeah. But no, keep doing what you're doing. This is super cool.
Well, thanks for coming on the show, Adin.
Absolutely.
And thanks for listening to this week's episode of Here at Haas. If you loved hearing Adin's story, don't forget to leave us a rating and review. And make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on future stories. As always, we'll link to a couple of the resources that Adin mentioned in the show notes. And until next time, I'm Paulina Lee, and this is Here at Haas.